Magos Carniceptor Thule had processed 11,473 criminals into servitors before he encountered the one who remembered his name. The revelation came not with screaming or resistance, but with a whisper so faint that Thule's auditory sensors nearly missed it beneath the grinding hum of the manufacturum's machines. Subject 749, Theta had already undergone the initial cortical excision. The crown of his skull sat in a sterile tray, bone fragments still glistening with cerebral fluid. The exposed brain matter pulsed with the rhythm of a dying autonomic system. Gray matter already stained purple, where Thule's precision blades had severed the connections between memory and self. Yet somehow, impossibly, the subject's lips moved. "My name is Castor Vrel." Thule's mechadendrites froze. The surgical theater fell into a silence broken only by the wet breathing of the subject's punctured lungs and the distant thunder of the forge hammers 3 levels below. 27 years of service to the Adeptus Mechanicus. 27 years of meticulously following the protocols of reconstitution. Not once had a subject retained enough cortical function to form words after the first cranial breach. Not once. The Magos leaned closer, his optic implants clicking through spectrum filters as he examined the ruins of 749 Theta's consciousness. The man's eyes had already been removed, replaced with crude optical receptors that would eventually interface with whatever servitor chassis awaited him. But tears leaked from the empty sockets anyway, mixing with the antiseptic fluid that bathed the surgical platform. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Thule had observed this phenomenon before. Phantom pain in amputated limbs, muscle memory persisting after cerebral lobotomy. The flesh holds its own terrible archive. Castor Vrel. The subject whispered again. The name emerged as a prayer, as if repetition could anchor a self already dissolving into biochemical entropy. I was a hab worker, level 17, my daughter, Mira. She had my eyes, she had. The words dissolved into a wet gurgle as Thule resumed the procedure. His servo arm descended with the second cutting implement. A monomolecular blade cooled to precisely 312 degrees below the freezing point of water. The cold would preserve the tissue he needed while destroying what he did not. Mercy played no role in the calculation, only efficiency. The blade sank into the medial prefrontal cortex, and Castor Vrel ceased to exist. Thule logged the anomaly as a footnote in his surgical record. Unusual verbal persistence post-excision. Likely cause: incomplete anesthetic delivery. Recommended correction: increase sedative concentration by 0.03% for subjects of similar mass and neural density. The notation took him 12 seconds to complete. Then he returned to his work, installing the behavioral control nodes that would transform the flesh before him into an obedient instrument of the Omniscia's will. But the name lingered in Thule's memory cores like a corrupted data file. Castor Vrel, hab worker, level 17, a daughter named Mira. Information without purpose. Information that served no function in the sacred task of servitor creation. Yet it persisted, occupying processing capacity that could have been allocated to more productive calculations. Thule had never questioned his work before. Questions were inefficient. Questions suggested doubt, and doubt was anathema to the Mechanicus's pursuit of pure, mechanical certainty. But as he fitted the cranial augmentation unit into the cavity where Castor Vrel's identity had once resided, Thule found himself running probability algorithms he had no logical reason to execute. How many of the 11,472 servitors he had created before this one had possessed names, had possessed daughters, had possessed anything beyond the crimes that condemned them to this table? The manufacturum's work continued around him in its eternal rhythm. In Chamber 9, Adept Kroll was installing weapons systems into the torso of a former recidivist, transforming a murderer into a gun servitor for the Astra Militarum. In Chamber 13, Tech Priest Voke was calibrating the neural inhibitors on a batch of labor servitors destined for the Promethium refineries of Talis Phi, where they would toil for decades until their augmented flesh finally failed. In Chamber 21, a team of servitors built more servitors, their dead hands assembling the very cages that had consumed their souls. 11,473. The number would rise to 11,474 before the shift ended, then 75, then 76. The manufactorum processed an average of 642 criminals into servitors every Terran standard day, 234,330 per year. Across the Imperium's millions of worlds, billions of sentient beings underwent this transformation annually. The mathematics were staggering. The necessity, according to the Administratum's projections, was absolute. Thule had never questioned necessity before. The subject that had been Castor Vrel twitched as the behavioral nodes synchronized with his brainstem. The movement was reflexive, involuntary, the last gasp of a nervous system reorganizing itself around its new architecture. Thule watched the neural readings stabilize. Personality matrix null. Memory access severed. Autonomous function minimal. Motor control awaiting external command protocols. Perfect. A perfect lobotomy. A perfect death of the self while the flesh endured. Thule's third mechadendrite reached for the vocoder assembly that would replace the subject's larynx, granting him the ability to speak only in the flat, emotionless monotone of a servitor receiving instructions. But he paused. His fingers, both flesh and steel, hesitated over the component tray. In that hesitation lived a question he could not quantify. If consciousness was merely the firing of neurons across synaptic gaps, and if those gaps could be severed with sufficient precision, then where had Castor Vrel gone? Into the void of non-existence. Into the Emperor's light, as the Ecclesiarchy promised. Or was he still there, buried beneath the behavioral nodes and inhibitor chips, screaming in a prison of his own meat? The Mechanicus taught that flesh was weak, that the purity of the machine was superior to the corruption of organic matter. Thule's own body was proof of this doctrine. 73% of his original biology had been replaced with sacred augmentations over the course of his service. He no longer required sleep in the traditional sense, merely entering a state of reduced cognition for 3 hours every 48 to allow his remaining organic components to process waste and repair cellular damage. He no longer experienced hunger as his ancestors had, consuming only nutrient paste calibrated to his exact metabolic requirements. He no longer felt pain in the conventional manner. His nervous system rerouted through pain editor implants that transformed agony into mere data. Yet he still possessed a name, Thule. He still remembered the man he had been before the Mechanicus claimed him. A foundry worker on Metallica, brilliant with numbers, recruited at age 16 when his ability to calculate load-bearing tolerances in his head attracted the attention of a passing tech priest. He remembered his mother's face. He remembered her tears when he left. He remembered choosing to leave, exercising the agency that Castor Vrel would never possess again. The work continued. Thule installed the vocoder. He connected the spinal interface that would allow the servitor to receive commands directly from a control throne or data tether. He sutured the scalp closed around the exposed augmentations, his stitches precise and economical. He applied the sacred oils and intoned the litany of reawakening, the ritual that would restart the subject's heart if it had stopped during the procedure. The heart had not stopped. It beat on, pumping blood to a brain that no longer knew why it needed blood, no longer knew anything at all. Servitor, 749 Theta. Activate. The thing on the table opened its optical receptors. Red light glowed in the empty sockets where Castor Vrel's eyes had been. The mouth opened. The vocoder hummed. This unit is active and awaiting assignment. Perfect diction. Perfect compliance. Perfect destruction. Thule logged the completion time and moved the servitor to the staging area where it would await transport to its designated facility. He did not look at it again. Looking served no purpose. The work was complete. The criminal had been punished. The Imperium had gained another tool. The calculus was immaculate, but the name persisted in his memory cores. Castor Vrel, Hab worker, level 17, father of Mira. Thule had processed 11,473 criminals into servitors, and for the first time, he wondered what that number truly meant. The shift ended when the manufacturum's klaxons sounded the 22nd hour, their wail cutting through the machine song of grinding gears and hissing hydraulics. Thule performed his sanctified ablutions at the cleansing station, scrubbing the blood and cerebral matter from his mechadendrites with solvent blessed by the priesthood of Mars. The ritual took 11 minutes and 47 seconds, the same duration it had taken every day for the past 27 years. Routine was holy, deviation was suspect. He descended through the manufacturum's levels on platforms that groaned under the weight of finished servitors being transported to their deployment vectors. Labor servitors bound for the agricultural domes. Combat servitors destined for the war zone on Vigilis. Cherubim, those obscene parodies of infants. Their infant corpses fitted with anti-grav suspensors and limited cogitators for use as flying messengers in ecclesiarchal ceremonies. The variety of forms was astounding. The underlying horror was constant. Thule's quarters occupied a small chamber on level -40, deep enough that the temperature remained constant, regardless of the season above. The room measured 4 meters by 3 meters, a recharge alcove for his augmentations, a data terminal for reviewing technical specifications, a small shrine to the Omnissiah, decorated with holy circuit diagrams and fragments of ancient technology. Nothing more, nothing less. Efficiency defined even rest. He connected his data ports to the terminal and began his nightly review of the day's processing statistics. 639 conversions completed across all chambers. 2 subjects had expired during the procedure due to unforeseen complications. Their body is recycled into component materials for the next batch. 4 subjects had required additional restraint due to unexpected resistance to the anesthetic protocols. Standard variations within acceptable parameters. Subject 749 Theta, Castor Vrel. Final disposition labor servitor, class IVB. Assigned to the water reclamation facilities beneath Hive Septimus. Expected service duration. 34 years before augmentation failure necessitates recycling. 34 years of pumping water through filtration systems. 34 years of mindless obedience. 34 years of existence without thought, without memory, without the capacity to understand what had been taken. The mathematics were clear. 1 criminal removed from Imperial society. 1 productive unit added to essential infrastructure. 1 daughter Mira, presumably now an orphan unless another relative had claimed her. Thule ran the calculation before he could stop himself. If Castor Vrel had been a Hab worker on level 17, his crime had likely been one of the standard infractions that fed the manufacturum's endless appetite. Theft of Imperial property, failure to meet production quotas, participation in unsanctioned gatherings, possession of forbidden literature, minor transgressions that, in the brutal arithmetic of Imperial justice, carried the same sentence as murder or heresy because the Imperium could not afford to waste flesh on mere incarceration. The data was accessible. Thule's clearance as a Magos Carniceptor granted him access to the criminal records of every subject he processed. He had never bothered to review them before. The crimes were irrelevant to the procedure. Yet his fingers, both organic and mechanical, moved across the terminal's interface, calling up the file of Subject 749 Theta. Castor Vrel, age 42 Terran standard years. Residence Hive Primus, level 17, Hab Block Gamma 97. Occupation Manufacturum Laborer, Textile Division. Criminal charge conspiracy to organize an unauthorized labor collective. Evidence, witness testimony from 3 co-workers. Trial duration 47 minutes. Sentence: servitor conversion, class IVB or higher. Appeals: denied. Dependents: 1 daughter, age 11, transferred to Imperial orphanage pending evaluation for Schola Progenium candidacy or general labor assignment. 47 minutes. From free man to meat in less time than it took to properly calibrate a plasma cutter. Thul's organic brain attempted to process the emotion forming in his chemistry, but his augmentations filtered it out, categorizing it as irrelevant noise in his cognitive patterns. Still, something persisted. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow. A glitch in his certainty. He closed the file. He performed his evening maintenance rituals, applying sacred oils to his joints and running diagnostic programs on his implants. Everything functioned within normal parameters. Everything except the thought that would not stop calculating itself in his mind. 11,473. How many had been like Castor Vrel? How many had been guilty of nothing more than the fundamental human impulse to resist suffering? Sleep, when it came, was not restful. Thul's reduced cognition state filled with fragmented images from his memory cores. Castor Vrel's lips forming his daughter's name. The wet sound of a monomolecular blade severing the connection between thought and self. The red glow of optical receptors in empty sockets. The perfect, terrible efficiency of transformation. He woke 17 minutes early, his autonomic systems pulling him from dormancy with an urgency he could not explain. The chamber was dark save for the faint blue glow of his shrine circuits. Somewhere far above, the day shift had already begun. The manufactorum never stopped, could never stop. The Imperium's appetite for servitors was as infinite as the crimes that fed it. Thul rose and prepared himself for the day's work with the same meticulous care he always employed. He intoned the morning prayers to the Omnissiah, asking for precision in his cutting and wisdom in his calculations. He consumed his nutrient paste, exactly 247 grams, the optimal amount for his metabolic requirements. He calibrated his mechadendrites, ensuring each servo motor operated at peak efficiency. Routine, holy routine. But when he arrived at Chamber 7, he found himself hesitating at the threshold. The surgical theater waited for him, sterile and ready. Subject 872 Alpha was already secured to the platform, sedated and prepared for conversion. The crime log displayed on the wall terminal listed the charges: heretical utterances against the God Emperor. A capital offense. No ambiguity in this one's guilt. Thul approached the platform and examined the subject. Male, approximately 30 years old. Face gaunt from months of interrogation and imprisonment. Body covered in the ritual scars of some outlawed cult, symbols that Thul's extensive database identified as marks of the chaos god Tzeentch. A true criminal. A real threat to the Imperium's stability. This one deserved the table. Yet when Thurl's mechadendrite reached for the cranial saw, he found himself pausing again. His logic engines ran through the familiar justifications. This subject had rejected the Emperor's light, had embraced the ruinous powers, had presumably led others into damnation with his heretical words. The Imperium was better served with his consciousness destroyed and his body repurposed. The mathematics were clear. But Castor Vrel had not been a heretic. Castor Vrel had merely wanted better conditions for himself and his fellow workers. Castor Vrel had committed the sin of hope in a galaxy where hope was a luxury the desperate could not afford. "Your name?" Thul heard himself say. The words emerged before his logic centers could suppress them. "What is your name?" The subject's eyes flickered open despite the sedatives in his system. Lips cracked and bleeding moved, forming words in a language Thul's translation protocols identified as bastardized Low Gothic mixed with the cant of the dark tongue. "I am the witness of change," the heretic rasped. "I am the prophet of the changer of ways. I am the voice that speaks the truths you fear." Thul felt nothing at these words. His emotional dampeners prevented the disgust and revulsion that a normal human would experience. Yet he observed his own reaction with a kind of clinical fascination. No fear, no anger, Just a cold assessment of the threat this individual posed, and the necessity of eliminating that threat while salvaging the useful components of his flesh. He activated the cranial saw. The procedure proceeded without complications. The heretic's brain was more resistant to the initial cuts than tech-thralls had been, his exposure to warp energies having created unusual neural pathways that Thule had to carefully navigate. But in the end, the result was the same. Personality matrix null. Memory access severed. The prophet of the changer of ways became Servitor 872 Alpha, destined for assignment as a combat servitor on some distant front where his augmented strength and grafted weaponry would kill the enemies of mankind without understanding what he killed or why. Thule processed 6 more subjects that day. A smuggler, 2 thieves, a woman who had murdered her husband in a fit of rage, a clerk who had falsified Imperial tithe records, a vagrant who had been caught sleeping in an unsanctioned area of the hive. Each one received the same meticulous care. Each one's consciousness was destroyed with surgical precision. Each one emerged as a perfect tool, ready to serve the Imperium in death, as they had failed to serve it in life. By the shift's end, Thule's count had risen to 11,480. 7 more souls processed. 7 more names he would never know. 7 more lives reduced to serial numbers and assignment designations. He performed his ablutions. He descended to his quarters. He connected to his data terminal and pulled up the files of each subject he had processed that day, reading their crimes and their histories, searching for something he could not name. The smuggler had been feeding his extended family, his wages insufficient to purchase proper rations. One of the thieves had stolen medicine for a sick child. The vagrant had been a former Imperial guardsman, broken by the horrors he had witnessed, and unable to reintegrate into civilian life. Not all of them were innocent. The murderer had killed without justification. The clerk had stolen millions of throne gelt from tax revenues. But even the guilty had possessed names, had possessed histories, had possessed the basic dignity of selfhood that Thule's work erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The days blurred together after that. Thule continued his work with the same precision he had always employed, but now each procedure was haunted by questions his augmentations could not suppress. He processed 20, 30, 40 subjects. The count climbed past 11,500, 11,600, 11,700. Each number represented a person. Each person had been someone. He began to notice details he had filtered out before. The way subjects would sometimes call out for loved ones during the initial stages of the procedure, before the sedatives fully took hold. The faint tremors that persisted in servitor hands, muscle memory of tasks their minds could no longer recall. The occasional malfunction where a servitor would freeze in the middle of an assigned task, its damaged brain attempting to process an instruction it no longer had the capacity to understand. In Chamber 13, Thule witnessed a labor servitor undergo catastrophic failure during a routine maintenance check. The servitor had been created 7 years prior from a criminal whose name Thule did not know. It had served without incident in a Promethium refinery, operating the same valve mechanism for 26,000 consecutive shifts. Then, without warning, it had simply stopped. The tech priest overseeing the maintenance had opened the servitor's cranial casing to examine the neural architecture, and Thule had seen something that his instruments could not explain. The servitor's brain, what remained of it, had been weeping. Not metaphorically, literally weeping, tears flowing from the exposed brain matter down the interior of the skull casing. The tech priest had noted it as a hydraulic malfunction, an accumulation of excess cerebrospinal fluid. But Thule had seen the readings. The fluid was not cerebrospinal. It was the product of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, the biochemical signatures of terror and anguish. The servitor's body had continued to function. Its heart had continued to beat. But somewhere in the ruins of its lobotomized consciousness, something had been suffering. For 7 years, 26,000 shifts, every moment an eternity of wordless horror. They recycled it. That was the protocol. Failed servitors were broken down for parts, their augmentations salvaged for the next batch, their organic components rendered into protein paste for the hive's reclamation vats. Efficient, practical, necessary. Thul returned to his chamber that night and did not perform his evening rituals. Instead, he sat in the darkness, his augmentations humming their quiet mechanical song, and attempted to calculate a number he knew was impossible to determine. How many servitors across the Imperium were suffering at this very moment? How many broken minds were trapped in flesh prisons, aware enough to experience torment, but not aware enough to understand it or escape it? The Imperium of man spanned 1 million worlds. Conservative estimates placed the total human population at several quadrillion individuals. If even a fraction of a % of that population was converted into servitors annually, and if even a fraction of those conversions failed to completely eliminate consciousness, the number was astronomical. The suffering was infinite, and Thul's work contributed to it every single day. He could stop. The thought occurred to him with such force that his logic engines immediately flagged it as a critical error in his reasoning protocols. He could refuse to process another subject, could cite mechanical failure, cognitive malfunction, anything to remove himself from the work. But the mechanicus did not tolerate failure. Refusal to perform assigned duties was itself a crime, punishable by the very fate he would be refusing to inflict on others. More than that, if Thul stopped, another Magos would simply take his place. The work would continue. The Imperium demanded servitors, demanded them by the billions to keep its vast machinery functioning. Without servitors, the manufactorums would grind to a halt. The void ships would lack crew. The armies would lose their support infrastructure. The entire edifice of humanity's galactic dominion depended on an endless supply of lobotomized slaves created from the flesh of criminals and the desperate. Castor Vrel had understood this, perhaps, had seen the machinery of oppression and tried to resist it, knowing resistance was futile but unable to accept submission. And for that courage, for that fundamental human refusal to quietly accept suffering, he had been destroyed. His daughter, Mira, now resided in an Imperial orphanage, being indoctrinated into the same system that had consumed her father, learning to accept the necessity of servitors and the righteousness of the Imperium's cruel justice. In 30 years, if she failed to meet her quotas or spoke a heretical word or committed any of the 1,000 minor infractions that fed the manufactorum's appetite, Myra might find herself on Thul's table. He might process her without knowing, might destroy her consciousness as efficiently as he had destroyed her father's. The cycle was perfect. The cycle was eternal. Thul stood and approached his shrine to the Omnisa. The circuit diagrams glowed in the darkness, their patterns representing the sacred knowledge of the machine god. The mechanicus taught that all knowledge was holy. That understanding the mechanisms of creation brought one closer to divine truth. But what truth could be found in this understanding? What holiness in the perfect, mechanical process of soul murder? He reached out with his organic hand and touched the central circuit diagram, his fingers tracing the pathways of current and potential. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity, each component serving a specific function, the whole greater than the sum of its parts. A servitor's neural architecture followed similar principles. Remove the unnecessary components. Streamline the pathways. Optimize for a single purpose. Create perfection through subtraction. The fundamental error, Thul realized, was in believing that human consciousness was merely another machine to be optimized. That memory and personality and self-awareness were excess weight that could be jettisoned without consequence. The mechanicus worshipped the purity of the machine, but they had forgotten that machines, at their core, were tools created by conscious minds. destroy consciousness, and what remained was not purity, but absence. Not transcendence, but annihilation. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. If the Imperium ceased creating servitors, how would it survive? The galaxy was hostile beyond measure. Orcs breeding in the dark between stars. Tyrannid hive fleets devouring entire systems. The forces of chaos spilling from the warp to corrupt and destroy. Humanity clung to existence through sheer brutal efficiency, sacrificing individual dignity for collective survival. The math was ugly but undeniable. 1 billion servitors in eternal torment was a price worth paying if it meant 1 trillion free humans could continue to live. Was it? The question echoed in Thul's consciousness with the force of revelation. Was it truly worth it? Not in abstract ethical terms, but in practical, calculable reality. Did the Imperium's methods actually serve humanity's survival? Or did they merely perpetuate a system of cruelty that had become an end unto itself? Thul's fingers trembled against the circuit diagram. The tremor was minute, barely registering on his internal diagnostics, but it was real. Organic, human. His augmentations could not suppress it entirely because it originated from a part of himself that no amount of mechanical replacement could fully eliminate. The capacity for moral horror. He pulled his hand away from the shrine and returned to his data terminal. His fingers moved across the interface with purpose now, no longer hesitant. He called up the production statistics for the entire manufactorum. 642 servitors created per day, 234,330 per year. But those were just the numbers for this facility. He expanded the search, pulling data from every Mechanicus Forge world and conversion facility he could access. The numbers scrolled across his screen in staggering profusion. Billions of servitors created annually. Billions of minds destroyed. Billions of lives reduced to tools. And for what? To maintain the Imperium's bloated infrastructure. To serve as easily replaceable components in a machine so vast and complex that it had forgotten its original purpose. The Imperium of man had been created to preserve humanity, to protect the species from extinction in a hostile universe. But somewhere in the 10 millennia since the Emperor had walked among his people, that mission had been perverted. The Imperium no longer served humanity. Humanity now served the Imperium, feeding it their children, their labor, their very consciousness, to keep the machinery grinding forward into an uncertain future. Thul closed the data streams and sat in silence. His logic engines attempted to formulate a solution to the moral equation before him, but the variables were too complex, the suffering too vast. He was a single Magos in a galaxy of horrors. What could one person do against the weight of 10,000 years of institutionalized cruelty? Nothing. The answer was nothing. He could process his subjects or refuse and be processed in turn. He could question the system or accept it, but he could not change it. The Imperium was too large, too entrenched, too necessary for survival in its current form. Even if every tech priest and Magos simultaneously refused to create another servitor, the administratum would find other methods, would breed specialized human subspecies designed for mindless labor, would clone endless copies of the same obedient template, would extract compliance through other means equally horrific. The cruelty was not incidental to the Imperium's function. It was fundamental. Fear of servitor conversion kept the masses compliant. The spectacle of lobotomized criminals shuffling through the hives reminded everyone of the price of resistance. The system perpetuated itself through terror as much as through necessity. Thul had been part of that system for 27 years, had performed his role with meticulous precision, had never questioned because questions suggested weakness, and weakness was sin. But Castor Vrel had been weak, had asked for better conditions, a small mercy in a merciless galaxy, and his weakness had earned him oblivion. The next day, Thul returned to Chamber 7 and resumed his work. He processed 12 subjects over the course of his shift. A forger, a deserter from the Astra Militarum, a tech priest who had been caught performing unauthorized modifications to his augmentations. A woman who had killed an arbiter in self-defense. 8 more whose crimes Thul did not examine, whose names he did not learn. But before each procedure, he spoke a single sentence that was not part of the Mechanicus liturgy. Your name will be remembered. It was a lie. Thul's memory cores were vast, but not infinite. He would forget most of them. Their names would dissolve into the statistical aggregate of his work. But for that moment, before the saw began its cut, each subject existed as a person, was acknowledged as a person. It was the smallest possible act of rebellion, and it changed nothing. 11,817, 11,934, 12,106. The count continued its inexorable climb. Each number a name, each name a story, each story ending in the same oblivion. Months passed. Then a year. Thul's work continued with the same precision it had always possessed. But now every procedure carried the weight of consciousness. He could no longer pretend that he was merely maintaining machinery. He was destroying souls. The efficiency of the process did not absolve him. The necessity of the outcome did not grant him innocence. He was complicit in atrocity, and the mathematics of survival did not balance that equation. Other Magi in the manufactorum began to notice changes in his behavior. Small deviations from optimal protocol. Procedures taking 17 seconds longer than standard. Unnecessary pauses in the middle of operations. Thul's direct supervisor, Magos Dominus Krath, summoned him to a review chamber to discuss these aberrations. Krath was more machine than man, his original biology reduced to a brain case and a few organs suspended in sacred oils within a larger mechanical chassis. He had served the Mechanicus for 93 years and had personally overseen the creation of over 300,000 servitors. His voice emerged from a vocoder without inflection or emotion, pure data transmission. Magos Carniceptor Thul. Your recent performance metrics indicate a decline in efficiency. Processing time per subject has increased by an average of 2.7% over the past 6 months. This deviation requires explanation. Thul stood before his superior, his own augmentations humming quietly in the recycled air of the chamber. He could lie, could cite mechanical difficulties with his equipment or attribute the delays to increasingly complex subjects. But lies served no purpose. Truth was the only prayer he had left. I have become aware, Thul said, his organic vocal cords forming the words with difficulty, of the consciousness that persists in some servitors after conversion. The suffering inherent in their existence troubles my cognitive processes. Krath's optical sensors focused on Thul with increased intensity, analyzing his biosigns for evidence of corruption or malfunction. When he spoke, his vocoder carried a tone that Thul's auditory analysis identified as disappointment. You have allowed emotion to compromise your function. The subjects we process are criminals. Their suffering, to the extent that it exists, is punishment for their crimes against the Imperium. Your concern is misplaced. Not all subjects are criminals in any meaningful sense, Thul replied. Many are guilty only of poverty or desperation. Some are innocent of even that, condemned by false witnesses or circumstantial evidence. The system does not distinguish between the truly guilty and the merely convenient. The system, Krath said, his mechanical body leaning forward with a whir of servos, maintains the Imperium of man. Without servitors, our species would collapse into extinction within a generation. The infrastructure of survival requires sacrifice. You know this. You have always known this. Knowing and accepting are not the same state of being. Then you must achieve acceptance. The alternative is to join the subjects on your table. Is that your desire, Magos Carniceptor? To trade your augmented clarity for the oblivion of servitor conversion? Thul met his superior's optical sensors without flinching. If the choice is between complicity in atrocity and experiencing that atrocity myself, I am not certain which option represents the greater failure of conscience. The chamber fell silent save for the distant grinding of the manufactorum's machinery. Krath regarded Thrall for several long moments, his processors undoubtedly calculating the optimal response to this unprecedented deviation. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight Thrall had not anticipated. "I processed my first subject 79 years ago," Krath said. "A woman who had stolen food to feed her children during a famine. I remember her face. I remember the exact pressure required to breach her skull. I remember wondering, as you are wondering now, whether this was justice or merely necessity wearing justice as a mask." Thrall's optical receptors widened in surprise. The Magos Dominus's revelation cut through his expectations like a plasma cutter through steel. "You question the work." "I questioned," Krath corrected, past tense. "I questioned for 37 years, processed subjects while doubting the righteousness of their sentences, logged their names and remembered their crimes, real or fabricated. I carried the weight of conscience as you are carrying it now." "What changed?" Krath's mechanical body rotated, his back now to Thrall, his optical sensors gazing at the wall of the chamber, where the Mechanicus seal was emblazoned in red and silver. "I calculated the alternative. I ran the projections of what would occur if the Imperium ceased creating servitors. The collapse would begin within 5 years. Agricultural production would fail first, then manufacturum output, then void ship operations. The Astra Militarum would lose 60% of its combat effectiveness. Within 15 years, the Imperium would fracture. Within 30, humanity would be extinct, devoured by Xenos, and chaos in a galaxy that grants no mercy to the weak. Those projections assume current conditions persist," Tool said. "They do not account for alternative methodologies, automation through sanctified machine spirits rather than lobotomized humans, development of stable AI limited to specific functions, cloning technologies that could, all forbidden." Krath interrupted. "The prohibition against abominable intelligence is absolute. Cloning tech beyond basic replication is heresy. Every alternative you might propose has been considered and rejected over the course of 10 millennia. We are left with servitors or extinction. That is the equation. Then the equation is wrong." Krath turned back to face him. "Perhaps. But it is the equation we have. And until someone of sufficient power and vision chooses to solve it differently, we must work within the parameters we are given. The alternative is the death of our species. Can your conscience survive that?" Thrall had no answer. The question was not rhetorical. It was genuine, asked by one who had walked this path before and emerged on the other side of doubt into a cold, terrible certainty. Krath had chosen complicity over collapse, had accepted the necessity of atrocity because the alternative was worse. The logic was sound. The morality was monstrous. "Return to your work, Magos Carniceptor," Krath said, his vocoder carrying a note of something that might have been pity in a fully organic being. "Continue your procedures. Remember the names if you must, but do not allow your conscience to compromise your efficiency. The Imperium requires our service. The Omnissiah demands our precision, and the billions of humans who will never know your name depend on you to do what must be done, no matter how terrible that duty may be." Thrall left the chamber and returned to his work. He processed 8 subjects that day, thieves and murderers, heretics and traitors. Each one received his meticulous care. Each one's consciousness was destroyed with surgical precision. Each one's name he spoke aloud before beginning the procedure, a prayer to no god in particular, a ritual of acknowledgement in a galaxy that offered none. 11,473 had been the count when Caster Vrel spoke his name. Now it exceeded 15,000. 15,000 minds destroyed. 15,000 souls, if souls existed, cast into whatever darkness awaited beyond the veil of death. 15,000 servitors created, each one serving the Imperium in their own small way, maintaining the vast machine that kept humanity alive in a hostile universe. The mathematics were clear. The mathematics were damning. The mathematics were all Thrall had left. Years passed. Thul's count climbed past 20,000, then 25,000. His augmentations required more frequent maintenance. His organic components aged, gray creeping into his remaining hair, lines forming around his eyes. The Mechanicus could have replaced these failing systems, could have granted him another century of service with sufficient mechanical augmentation. But Thul declined each offer. He wanted to feel his mortality, wanted to know that this complicity had an end. In his 40th year of service to the Manufactorum, Thul processed Subject 417 Gamma. The crime log indicated theft of Imperial property, a standard charge. But when Thul examined the subject's face, recognition struck him with the force of a physical blow. She had Castor Vrel's eyes. Mira Vrel, now 23 Terran standard years old, lay sedated on his surgical table. The orphanage records were appended to her criminal file. Evaluated for Scola Progenium, rejected due to insufficient aptitude scores. Assigned to General Labor, Textile Manufactorum, Level 17. The same level where her father had worked. The same labor that had driven him to resist. And she, like him, had been caught organizing her fellow workers to demand better conditions. The cycle was perfect. The cycle was eternal. Thul's mechadendrites trembled as they reached for the cranial saw. His logic engine screamed at him to proceed, to complete the procedure, to fulfill his duty. But his organic brain, the core of consciousness that no amount of augmentation could fully suppress, rebelled. He had processed Castor Vrel 39 years ago, had destroyed the man's mind while his daughter lived on in ignorance. And now that daughter lay before him, guilty of the same sin of hope, about to suffer the same obliteration. If he proceeded, the crime would be complete. Father and daughter both consumed by the machinery. They had tried to resist. Their bloodline erased from consciousness while their flesh endured in eternal servitude. Perfect efficiency. Perfect horror. Thul's hand moved to the terminal that controlled the sedatives. He adjusted the dosage, lowering the suppressants that kept Mira unconscious. Her eyes flickered open, unfocused at first, then clearing as the drugs receded from her system. She looked at him with those eyes, her father's eyes, and understanding dawned in her expression. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the restraints holding her to the table. "Yes," Thul said. The honesty felt like absolution. "I am going to destroy your consciousness and transform your body into a servitor. It is my function. It is what I have done to 32,614 people before you, including your father." Mira's eyes widened. "My father. He's a labor servitor in the water reclamation facilities beneath Hive Septimus. He has been there for 39 years. He does not remember you. He does not remember himself, but he endures." Tears formed in Mira's eyes, running down her face to pool in her ears. Did he suffer? Thul could have lied, could have told her the procedure was painless, the death of self instantaneous and merciful. But he had spoken enough lies in his service to the Imperium. Truth was the only prayer he had left. "I do not know," he said. "The protocols are designed to eliminate suffering by eliminating the capacity to experience it. But I have observed aberrations. Servitors weeping without understanding why. Bodies remembering what minds have forgotten. The possibility exists that some fragment of consciousness persists, trapped and unable to express its torment. Your father may be suffering at this very moment. Or he may be truly dead, his body animated only by behavioral programming. I cannot tell you which fate awaits you." Mira closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths as she processed this information. When she opened them again, her gaze held a determination that Thul recognized from her father's final moments. "Then I have one request," she said. "Remember my name. Remember that I was a person. Remember that I tried to make things better, even though I failed. Don't let me disappear completely." Thul's organic hand reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her restrained hand. The gesture was forbidden, a violation of sterile procedure, but he no longer cared. "I will remember," he said. "Mira Vrel, daughter of Castor, Textile worker, organizer, you will be remembered. He increased the sedatives again, sending her back into unconscious. He could not grant her freedom, could not save her from the table, but he could give her the mercy of unconsciousness before the procedure began. It was the smallest possible act of kindness in a galaxy that offered none. The cranial saw descended. Thul's hands moved with the precision of 4 decades of practice. The procedure proceeded without deviation from protocol. Personality matrix null. Memory access severed. Servitor 417 gamma activated without complications. Assigned to agricultural servitude in the hydroponic domes of the upper hive. 32,615. That night, Thul did not return to his quarters. Instead, he descended to the lowest levels of the manufactorum, where the recycling vats processed failed servitors and organic waste into component materials. The air here was thick with chemical stench, caustic and sweet, the smell of dissolution. He stood at the edge of a vat, watching the green liquid bubble and churn as it broke down flesh into its constituent proteins. His logic engines presented him with a calculation. At his current rate of processing, accounting for increasing age and declining efficiency, Thul would create approximately 15,000 more servitors before his own death or mandatory conversion. 47,615 total. Nearly 50,000 consciousnesses destroyed by his hands. 50,000 names he would never fully remember despite his promise. The Imperium would endure. Humanity would survive another generation built on the broken backs and erased minds of those deemed expendable. The mathematics were sound. The necessity was absolute, and his complicity was eternal. Thul reached up with his organic hand and touched the neural interface at the base of his skull, the connection that linked his consciousness to his augmentations. One pull, one sharp motion, and he could sever that connection, could fall into the vat and let the chemicals dissolve both his sin and his suffering, end his complicity, escape the equation. But escape was a luxury the desperate could not afford. If he died, another Magos would take his place, would process Myras and casters with the same efficiency, perhaps without even the burden of remembering their names. His death would change nothing. His survival changed nothing. The machinery ground on regardless of conscience or consequence. Thul withdrew his hand from the interface and turned away from the vat. He climbed back through the manufactorum's levels, past chambers where servitors built servitors, where the dead-minded created more of their kind in an eternal cycle of reproduction. He returned to his quarters. He performed his evening rituals. He connected to his data terminal and logged the day's procedures with meticulous precision. Subject 417 Gamma. Mira Vrel, age 23. Crime conspiracy to organize unauthorized labor collective. Sentence servitor conversion, agricultural class. Father. Previously processed as Subject 749 Theta. Mother deceased. Appeals denied. The file closed. The data was recorded. The machinery continued. In the water reclamation facilities beneath Hive Septimus, Servitor 749 Theta operated valve mechanism 779A for the 691,342nd time. His augmented hands moved with mechanical precision, turning the wheel exactly 180 degrees before resetting. The work was endless. The work was purposeless. The work was all that remained. In the hydroponic domes of the upper hive, Servitor 417 Gamma would soon begin tending the nutrient vats that fed the population above. Her augmented body would move between the rows of growing tanks, monitoring chemical levels, adjusting flow rates, performing the same tasks for decades until her flesh finally failed. Father and daughter both serve the Imperium now, their minds gone, their bodies enduring together in servitude, but forever unable to recognize each other. The true cost of eternal servitude in the Imperium could not be calculated in throne gelt or processing hours. It could not be measured in productivity metrics or efficiency ratings. The true cost was the annihilation of the self, repeated billions of times across 1,000,000 worlds. A sacrifice so vast and terrible that the mathematics of necessity could never justify it completely. Yet the sacrifice continued. Would continue. Must continue, because the alternative was extinction. And extinction was worse than any torture consciousness could endure. Magos Carniceptor Thul processed 32,615 criminals into servitors over the course of his 40-year career. He remembered 173 names. The rest dissolved into statistical aggregate, into the vast ocean of suffering that kept the Imperium functioning. On his deathbed, declining the augmentations that could have granted him immortality, he whispered those 173 names like a litany, a prayer to the dead, an accounting of sins that could never be absolved. The last name he spoke was Miravrel. The manufacturer processed 642 servitors on the day Thul died. The work continued without pause, without acknowledgement, without end. The machinery of the Imperium ground on, built on broken minds and lobotomized slaves, maintained by those who understood the horror, but lacked the power to change it. Justified by mathematics that balanced billions of conscious beings against the survival of a species. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there was only servitude. And servitude, like war, was eternal. Thul's replacement arrived 3 days after his funeral rites. Magos Carniceptor Ven was young by Mechanica standards. Only 14 years of service, his augmentations still gleaming with recent installation. He possessed the enthusiasm of the newly initiated, the certainty of one who had not yet processed enough subjects to doubt the righteousness of his work. He reviewed Thul's processing records with approval, noting the precision of the procedures, the efficiency of the conversions, the meticulous documentation of every step. An exemplary record, Ven said to Magos Dominus Krath during his orientation. 32,615 successful conversions over 4 decades. Minimal complications. Optimal resource utilization. I aspire to achieve similar metrics during my tenure. Krath's optical sensors dimmed slightly, a gesture that his translation protocols might have interpreted as sadness if he still possessed the emotional capacity for such things. Magos Carniceptor Thul was precise in his work. You would do well to emulate his technical skill. However, be warned that excessive contemplation of the subject's previous identities can compromise operational efficiency. I understand, Magos Dominus. The subjects are criminals. Their transformation serves the Imperium. Sentiment is an inefficiency I will not permit in my procedures. Krath said nothing more. He had heard such declarations before, from Thul decades ago, from himself a lifetime before that. Certainty was the armor of the uninitiated. Time would strip it away, piece by piece, until only the raw truth remained. They were murderers dressed in the robes of necessity. Their hands stained with blood, no amount of sacred oils could cleanse. Ven took his place in Chamber 7 and began his work. His first subject was a woman convicted of heretical speech, caught preaching about the emperor's fallibility in the lower hive markets. She was 63 years old, her body already failing from a lifetime of malnutrition and hard labor. The conversion process would grant her perhaps another decade of service before her augmented flesh finally surrendered to entropy. Ven processed her with flawless precision. The cranial breach took exactly 17 minutes. The neural excision required only 12 cuts, each one placed with millimetric accuracy. The behavioral conditioning nodes integrated seamlessly with her brain stem. She emerged as Servitor 931 Delta, assigned to waste reclamation in the Underhive, where she would spend her remaining years, sorting through refuse and biological waste. The woman's name had been Lyra Kostrovan. She had 7 children, 19 grandchildren, and 42 great-grandchildren spread across 3 hive levels. She had spoken against the emperor not from malice, but from despair, watching her family starve while the upper hive feasted, wondering aloud whether a god who permitted such suffering deserved worship. For this moment of weakness, this single instance of voicing the doubt that lived in billions of hearts across the Imperium. She had been condemned. Ven did not learn her name, did not review her file beyond the crime log, did not wonder about the family she left behind or the despair that had driven her to speak forbidden truths. He logged the completion time, sterilized his instruments, and moved on to the next subject. The work continued. In the hydroponic domes, Servitor 417 Gamma tended the nutrient vats with mechanical efficiency. Her augmented hands adjusted chemical feeds, monitored pH levels, removed contaminated growth medium. The work was simple, repetitive, designed to be performed by something, with just enough cognitive function to recognize patterns, but not enough to question them. She performed it flawlessly, day after day, shift after shift, her body moving through the motions, while whatever remained of her consciousness drifted in darkness. Sometimes, when the dome's environmental systems shifted temperature, or when unexpected sounds echoed through the vast agricultural space, her body would pause. The servitor designation protocols logged these interruptions as minor glitches, momentary lapses in the behavioral conditioning that required adjustment. Tech priests would arrive to recalibrate her neural inhibitors, strengthening the blocks that prevented autonomous thought. The pauses would cease for a time. Then they would return, inexplicable and troubling. During one such pause, as Servitor 417 Gamma stood motionless between two rows of growing tanks, a worker passing through the dome noticed something unusual. The servitor's vocoder, which should have remained silent except when responding to direct commands, emitted a soft sound. Not words exactly, not even fully formed phonemes. Just a noise that resembled, very faintly, the beginning of a name. The worker reported the malfunction. A tech priest arrived within the hour, opened the servitor's cranial casing, and discovered unusual activity in the regions of the brain that had supposedly been rendered inert during conversion. Electrical patterns that shouldn't exist. Neural pathways that had somehow regenerated, forming new connections around the scar tissue of the lobotomy. The tech priest had seen such aberrations before, though they were rare. The brain, that most mysterious of organs, sometimes refused to stay dead even when all logic said it should. The solution was simple. Additional cuts, deeper excisions, complete removal of the problematic tissue. The tech priest performed the procedure there in the dome, the servitor still standing, still technically functional, while he carved away the last traces of whatever ghost had been trying to surface. The electrical activity ceased. The unauthorized neural pathways were severed. The servitor returned to perfect, silent compliance. The worker, who had reported the malfunction, received a commendation for vigilance. The tech priest logged the incident as a routine maintenance correction. Neither of them knew the servitor's designation number corresponded to a woman named Mira Vrel. Neither of them knew that her father labored in similar mindless servitude 3 levels below. Neither of them would have cared if they had known. The Imperium's machinery did not run on sentiment. Magos Carnoceptor Ven processed 100 subjects in his first month, 200 in his second. His efficiency exceeded thralls by an average of 4.3%, a margin that earned him recognition from his superiors. He attributed his success to his willingness to embrace full mechanization of the process, removing the inefficiencies of human judgment wherever possible. He had requisitioned additional servo skulls to perform the initial cranial cuts, automated the installation of behavioral nodes, streamlined the post-procedure monitoring protocols. Each innovation saved precious seconds, allowing him to process more subjects per shift. In his third month, Ven was assigned a subject that challenged his systematic approach. The man strapped to his surgical table was a former Astra Militarum officer, a captain who had served with distinction in the Damocles Gulf before returning to his home world and being caught in a scandal involving the distribution of military supplies to starving civilians. The crime was technically treason, the theft of Imperial property in a time of war. The penalty was unambiguous, but the man possessed extensive augmentations from his military service. Subdermal armor plating, neural combat accelerators, reinforced skeletal structure, integrated voxcaster for battlefield communications. Converting him to a servitor required careful extraction of the military-grade enhancements, which were too valuable to destroy, while preserving enough of his physical integrity to make the resulting servitor functional. The procedure was delicate, complex, requiring judgment that could not be delegated to servo skulls and automated systems. Ven performed the work himself, his mechadendrites moving with practiced precision through the layers of augmentation and flesh. The extractions went smoothly until he reached the neural combat accelerators, which had been integrated directly into the subject's brain tissue. Removing them without causing catastrophic damage required extraordinary care. Ven's hands, both organic and mechanical, worked for 3 hours, teasing apart synthetic and biological matter with micro-manipulators designed for the most delicate operations. During this extended procedure, the subject's sedation began to wear thin. The standard dosage was calculated for unaugmented humans, and the former officer's military modifications included metabolic enhancers that processed chemicals more rapidly than normal physiology. Ven noticed the change in the subject's vital signs, but calculated that the remaining procedure time was short enough that adjusting the sedation mid-operation would pose greater risk than continuing. The subject's eyes opened. "Please," the man whispered, his voice distorted by the damage already done to his skull and vocal apparatus. "Please, I only wanted to help them. They were starving. Children. I couldn't tell." Ven's optical sensors focused on the subject's face, analyzing the neural patterns that allowed speech despite the partial lobotomy already performed. Fascinating. The military augmentations had created redundant pathways, backup systems that allowed continued function even with primary systems compromised. A useful observation for future procedures involving similarly augmented subjects. "Please," the man said again. "My name is Marcus Torvan. I have a wife, 2 sons. They don't know what happened to me. Please, just tell them." Silence. Ven commanded, his vocoder flat and emotionless. "Speech is unnecessary. Your identity is no longer relevant. You are Subject 684 Sigma, designated for conversion to Combat Servitor, Class Athera A. I served the Emperor for 20 years, Marcus Torvan said, tears streaming from his eyes, even as his exposed brain glistened under the surgical lamps. 20 years on the front lines. Watched my brothers die. Killed his enemies without hesitation. This is how my service ends. This is the reward for loyalty." Ven did not answer. Instead, he increased the sedative flow manually, flooding the subject's system with enough chemical suppressant to silence him, even through his augmented metabolism. The whispered pleas faded into unconsciousness. Ven completed the procedure without further complications, installing the combat servitor's weapon systems where the man's arms had been, grafting armor plating to his torso, programming his ruined brain with the simple combat algorithms that would make him an effective, if mindless, instrument of war. Servitor 684 Sigma was shipped to a conflict zone on the eastern fringe within a week. There, it would stand in defensive positions for days without rest, operating heavy bolters against whatever enemies the Imperium deemed necessary to kill. When the enemy fire finally destroyed it, as statistics said it would within an average of 7 months, its remains would be salvaged for parts and its organic components rendered down for recycling. Marcus Torvan's wife and sons never learned his fate. The administratum's records listed him as executed for treason, his body cremated according to standard protocol. They mourned him as dead, unaware that something bearing his flesh still existed, still served, still killed in the Emperor's name without knowing why or caring. Ven logged the procedure as a success and moved on to the next subject. That evening, during his maintenance cycle, he found himself running unnecessary calculations, probability matrices analyzing the likelihood that Marcus Torvan's plea had been genuine versus strategic manipulation, assessment of whether the man's military service should have been considered during sentencing, speculation about the welfare of the family he had mentioned, inefficient thoughts, wasteful cognitive processes. Ven purged them from his active memory and ran diagnostic programs to identify the source of this deviation from optimal function. The diagnostics returned no errors. His augmentations operated within normal parameters. The inefficiency originated from his organic components, from the biological brain that no amount of mechanization could fully control. He had processed 273 subjects. Marcus Torvan was the first whose words had persisted beyond the procedure. Ven assured himself this was merely statistical variation. Eventually, given enough subjects, one would speak during the operation. It meant nothing, changed nothing. The work continued, but that night, in the privacy of his quarters, Ven found himself accessing the criminal files of his processed subjects. Not all of them, just a few. A random sample to satisfy his curiosity about the nature of their crimes. Academic interest, nothing more. Understanding the types of criminals he processed might improve his efficiency by allowing him to anticipate common augmentation configurations or resistance patterns. He told himself this as he read through file after file. Told himself this as he learned their names, their crimes, their sentences. Told himself this as patterns emerged from the data, patterns that his logic engines could not ignore. 47% of his processed subjects had been convicted of economic crimes: theft, fraud, embezzlement, unauthorized redistribution of resources, crimes born of poverty and desperation, not malice. 23% had been convicted of sedition or heresy, charges that Ven's analysis suggested were often politically motivated, used to eliminate dissidents and inconvenient voices. 18% had been convicted of desertion or dereliction of duty, fleeing conflicts they could not survive or refusing orders they considered unjust. Only 12% had been convicted of violent crimes against persons, and even among those, many had been defending themselves or their families. The mathematics troubled him. If criminal conversion to servitor status was meant as punishment and deterrent, why did the majority of subjects seem to be punished for the crime of being poor, desperate, or insufficiently obedient? Why did the system seem designed to funnel the vulnerable into processing chambers rather than to extract justice from the genuinely dangerous? Ven closed the files and attempted to purge these thoughts as he had purged the others. But they persisted, recursive loops in his cognitive processes that his augmentations could not suppress. He had been taught that the Imperium's justice was absolute, that those condemned to servitor conversion deserved their fate through their own moral failures. Yet the data suggested otherwise. Suggested that the system perpetuated itself through necessity rather than righteousness, consuming the weak to fuel the machinery of survival. He thought of Marcus Torvan, who had fed starving children with military supplies and been condemned as a traitor. He thought of the elderly woman preaching about the emperor's fallibility, desperate enough to risk everything for the chance to voice her suffering. He thought of all the subjects whose files he had not read, whose names he did not know, who had passed through his hands and emerged as hollow instruments of the Imperium's will. 3 months. He had lasted 3 months before the certainty began to crack. The following day, Ven processed 6 subjects. His efficiency had decreased by 2.1%, a deviation his supervisors would notice if it continued. He attempted to compensate by working faster, by delegating more tasks to his automated systems, by reducing his direct engagement with each subject's procedure. But speed and distance could not protect him from the knowledge he had acquired. Each subject on his table now carried invisible weight, a history, A context, a life that his work would end, subject after subject, day after day, week after week. The count climbed. 300, 400, 500. Ven's efficiency stabilized at a level slightly below thralls. Good enough to avoid censure, but not exceptional enough to earn commendation. He told himself he had achieved equilibrium, found the balance between conscience and duty. He told himself he could continue indefinitely at this pace. He was lying to himself, and his logic engines knew it. In the water reclamation facilities, Servitor 749 Theta operated valve mechanisms 779A for the 720,000th time. The servitor's flesh had deteriorated significantly over 4 decades of service. Muscle tissue had atrophied despite regular nutrient infusions. Skin had cracked and scarred from constant exposure to chemical vapors. The augmentations required increasingly frequent maintenance as biological rejection responses slowly overcome the immunosuppressants that kept flesh and machine integrated. A tech priest performing routine inspection noted that the servitor's operational efficiency had declined by 9% over the past year. Projections indicated complete failure within 18 months. The standard protocol was clear. Continue operation until catastrophic breakdown, then recycle components. Servitors were not repaired when they approached end of service. They were replaced. The tech priest logged his findings and moved to the next servitor in the line. Servitor 749 Theta continued its work, unaware of the approaching termination of its existence, unaware that it had ever possessed the capacity for awareness, unaware of everything except the endless repetition of turning valve 779, a precisely 180 degrees every 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 40 years of service, 40 years of mindless labor, 40 years since Caster-Vrel had ceased to exist and this hollow thing had taken his place. If anything of Caster remained, buried deep beneath the behavioral conditioning and neural damage, it had long since transcended suffering into something beyond consciousness, beyond thought, beyond even the concept of self. The mercy of complete obliteration, perhaps, or the horror of existence reduced to pure mechanism. No one knew. No one could know. The servitor could not report its internal state, and external observation revealed only function or dysfunction, operation or failure. In 6 months, when the servitor's deterioration accelerated beyond acceptable parameters, it would be deactivated and transported to the recycling vats. The augmentations would be extracted and refurbished for installation in new servitors. The organic remains would be dissolved into component chemicals, protein chains and mineral compounds that would be reintegrated into the manufacturum's supply streams. Nothing wasted, nothing mourned. Perfect efficiency. Mira would outlast her father by perhaps 5 years, her younger flesh more resilient to the stress of servitor conversion. Then she too would fail, would be recycled, would disappear into the chemical vats as if she had never existed. Father and daughter, their rebellion crushed, their consciousness destroyed, their very atoms scattered and repurposed in service to the Imperium they had tried to resist. The cycle was perfect. The cycle was eternal. The cycle devoured everything. Magos Carniceptor Ven processed his 1,000th subject 6 months into his tenure. The milestone earned him a brief commendation from Magos Dominus Krath, acknowledgement of consistent performance and reliable service. Ven accepted the recognition with appropriate humility, though internally his reaction protocols registered something his translation systems struggled to classify. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something closer to resignation, perhaps, or the cold acceptance of inevitability. 1,000 consciousnesses destroyed by his hands, 1,000 minds erased, 1,000 lives reduced to servitor designations and assignment codes. The number felt simultaneously massive and insignificant. Massive because he could not truly comprehend the weight of 1,000 individual existences, each one as complex and valuable as his own. Insignificant because Thule had processed 32,000, because the manufacturer processed hundreds of thousands annually, because billions suffered this fate across the Imperium every year. What did 1,000 matter against billions? What did billions matter against extinction? The questions circled in Ven's consciousness, like servo skulls orbiting a target, endlessly patient, impossible to dismiss. He had entered the Mechanicus seeking certainty, craving the purity of mathematics and the clarity of machine logic. But the more he understood the system he served, the less certain anything became. The Imperium required servitors. That was fact. But did it require this many? Did every petty thief and desperate parent need to be lobotomized and enslaved? Could the same functions be achieved through other means that didn't demand the systematic destruction of human consciousness on an industrial scale? The answer, Ven discovered through careful research in the Mechanicus archives, was complicated. Yes, alternative technologies existed, fully automated systems using machine spirits, vat-grown biological components without true sentience, even limited artificial intelligences, carefully constrained and monitored, could perform many servitor functions without requiring human sacrifice. These technologies had been explored, developed, sometimes even implemented on small scales, but they had all been abandoned or suppressed. The prohibitions against abominable intelligence made AI development heretical. Vat-grown biological components proved unreliable without some spark of genuine consciousness to animate them. Machine spirits required extensive maintenance and were prone to malfunction. And perhaps most damningly, none of these alternatives provided the secondary function that servitors fulfilled: terror. The threat of servitor conversion kept populations compliant. Workers met their quotas. Citizens reported their neighbors. Dissent remained whispered and small. The Imperium maintained order not just through the labor of its servitors, but through the fear of becoming one. An automated system could not inspire that fear. A vat-grown component could not serve as a cautionary tale. Only the visible transformation of a human being into a mindless slave could achieve the psychological impact necessary to maintain imperial control. Servitors were not just tools. They were weapons of social control, instruments of terror masquerading as economic necessity. Ven sat in his quarters with this knowledge, his processors attempting to integrate it into his understanding of his role. He had believed himself a technician, performing a necessary function for the survival of humanity. But he was also an executioner, an instrument of oppression, a participant in a system of control that ground human dignity into paste as efficiently as it ground human flesh. The realization should have paralyzed him, should have driven him to refuse further work, to seek reassignment, to flee the manufactorum and everything it represented. But Ven was a magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He understood systems, understood that every component had a function, and removing one component simply meant another would take its place. If he stopped, someone else would continue his work, someone perhaps less troubled by conscience, perhaps more enthusiastic about the crushing of human will. Was it better to continue, carrying the weight of knowledge and conscience, maintaining what small mercy he could in his procedures, or better to refuse, preserving his own moral purity while the work continued with potentially greater cruelty? The equation had no clear solution. Both paths led to damnation. Both paths demanded the sacrifice of something essential. Ven chose to continue, not from conviction, not from certainty, but from the simple, terrible pragmatism that defined life in the Imperium. Someone had to do this work, and he was fractionally more likely to do it humanly than his replacement would be. He returned to Chamber 7 the next day and processed 8 subjects. He spoke each of their names before beginning the procedures, a ritual he had adopted without consciously deciding to, inherited perhaps from the ghost of Thul's conscience that haunted these chambers. The names meant nothing to the subjects once he finished his work, meant nothing to the Imperium that consumed them, but they meant something to Ven, some small acknowledgement that he had not yet fully surrendered his humanity to the machinery of his augmentations. The work continued. 1,000 became 2,000. 2,000 became 3,000. Years passed in the grinding rhythm of the manufactorum, each day identical to the last, each procedure a repetition of eternal crime. Ven's organic components aged. Gray appeared in his remaining hair. Lines formed around his eyes. His supervisors suggested additional augmentation, replacement of failing biological systems with superior mechanical alternatives. He accepted some, declined others, maintaining just enough humanity to feel the weight of what he was doing. Other magi, in the manufactorum, noticed his patterns, noticed that he remembered names, spoke them aloud during procedures, maintained records that went beyond standard documentation requirements. Some considered it an eccentricity, a harmless quirk of an otherwise competent operator. Others recognized it for what it was: resistance, passive and ultimately futile, against the horror of their shared work. None of them reported him. None of them interfered, because deep in their own memory cores, suppressed by augmentations and duty, but never fully erased, they carried similar knowledge. They had all processed subjects who spoke during procedures, had all encountered crimes that seemed disproportionate to punishment, had all calculated the mathematics of suffering and found no comfort in the equations. The Adeptus Mechanicus worshipped the purity of the machine, but its magi remained partially human, and human consciousness, no matter how suppressed or augmented, could not fully embrace what they were required to do. So they continued their work in silent complicity, each bearing their private weight of conscience, each hoping that their small acts of recognition and mercy meant something against the vast tide of institutional cruelty. In the 20th year of Ven's service, the manufactorum received an unusual shipment of subjects, not criminals this time, but refugees from a planetary conflict in a nearby system. The administratum had determined that resettlement was economically unfeasible. The refugees, numbering in the thousands, had been classified as surplus population and condemned to servitor conversion en masse. Their only crime was surviving a war that had rendered their world uninhabitable, and their labor redundant. The shipment arrived in cargo containers, packed so tightly that 30% had suffocated during transport. Those who survived emerged hollow-eyed and starving, barely conscious, their bodies already halfway to the oblivion that awaited them on the surgical tables. Children clung to parents who no longer had the strength to comfort them. Elderly couples held each other with trembling hands. Young men and women who should have had futures stared at nothing, their minds already broken by the casual cruelty of their treatment. Ven stood in the receiving bay and watched the containers emptied, watched families separated, sorted by age and physical capability, classified and assigned to different conversion protocols. Children below a certain age would be converted to cherubim, their small bodies fitted with antigrav suspensors and simple cogitators. Adults would become labor servitors, combat servitors, specialized workers depending on their physical characteristics. The elderly and infirm would be recycled immediately, their bodies too damaged for conversion but still useful as raw materials. For the first time in 20 years, Ven felt something his emotional dampeners could not suppress. Not anger, precisely. Not sorrow, though both were present. Something else. Something his augmented consciousness struggled to classify, because it existed in the liminal space between human feeling and machine logic. Call it witnessing. Call it recognition. Call it the terrible clarity that comes when abstract horror crystallizes into concrete reality. These were not criminals, were not heretics or traitors or violent offenders. They were simply people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who had survived when the Imperium would have preferred they died, who had committed the unforgivable sin of needing help from a system designed to extract rather than provide. And he was going to destroy them, was going to take his cranial saw and his behavioral conditioning nodes and his behavioral node implants and systematically erase everything that made them human. Was going to transform children into grotesque mockeries, floating ornaments for ecclesiarchal ceremonies. Was going to condemn mothers and fathers to decades of mindless servitude while their children drifted overhead on anti-grav suspensors, neither recognizing nor recognized. The shipment would keep the manufactorum operating at capacity for 3 months. Ven and his fellow Magi would process subjects in shifts around the clock, maximizing efficiency to handle the volume. The production quotas would be exceeded. The administratum would commend the facility for its performance, and thousands of innocent people would cease to exist, their consciousness destroyed, their flesh repurposed, their suffering absolute and eternal. Ven could refuse, could declare the order unjust, could cite the Mechanicus's own principles about the sanctity of knowledge and consciousness, could attempt to intervene on behalf of these refugees who had harmed no one and threatened nothing. But refusal would accomplish nothing except his own condemnation. The work would proceed. Someone else would perform the procedures he declined. The refugees would be converted regardless of his conscience. Or he could continue, could add thousands more to his count, could process children and parents with the same cold efficiency he had developed over 20 years of service, could maintain the system through his participation, validate the horror through his complicity, become fully what the Imperium demanded, an instrument of efficient atrocity. There was a third option, one that Ven's logic engines had been calculating for years, refining the parameters, assessing the probabilities. An option that would not save the refugees, would not reform the system, would not change anything except his own participation in the machinery of suffering. That night, after processing 37 refugees, Ven returned to his quarters and composed a final entry in his personal logs. I have created 5,812 servitors over the course of my service to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each one was a person. Each one had a name. I cannot remember all their names, though I tried. But I remember enough to understand what I have done, what I have been, what I have participated in for 20 years. The Imperium requires servitors. This is fact. Whether it requires them in these numbers, created through these methods, from these populations, remains a question I cannot answer with certainty. But I know that my continued participation serves no purpose except to maintain the system as it exists. Another Magos will take my place, will perhaps be more efficient, less troubled by conscience, more fully committed to the work. This knowledge does not absolve me, does not grant me escape from complicity, but it allows me to choose how my own participation ends. I make this choice consciously, with full awareness of its futility. I save no one, change nothing, improve nothing. I merely remove myself from the equation, one small inefficiency in a vast machine that will continue grinding regardless. To whoever discovers these logs, remember the names I recorded. Remember that servitors were people. Remember that the necessity we invoke to justify this horror may be real, but it is also insufficient. Necessity is not righteousness. Survival is not morality. The mathematics of extinction do not balance the equation of suffering. The Imperium endures. Whether it deserves to endure is a question I leave to others. Ven closed his data terminal. He performed his evening rituals one final time, cleaning his augmentations with sacred oils, intoning the prayers to the Omnissiah that he no longer believed granted anything except the comfort of routine. Then he took the plasma cutter from his tool array, adjusted it to full power, and placed it against his organic brain tissue. The Mechanicus taught that flesh was weak, that the purity of the machine transcended the limitations of biology. But in the final moment, Ven discovered that flesh possessed one capability that machines could not replicate: the ability to choose oblivion over complicity, to refuse continuation when continuation meant perpetual atrocity. He activated the plasma cutter. Magos Dominus Krath discovered the body during morning rounds. The investigation concluded that Ven had suffered a catastrophic malfunction in his augmentation systems, a fault in the behavioral conditioning that had caused him to turn his tools on himself. Such malfunctions were rare, but not unprecedented. The Mechanicus logged the incident, performed the appropriate funeral rites, and assigned a replacement to Chamber 7 within 48 hours. The refugee processing continued without interruption. The new Magos was young, eager, certain of the righteousness of his work. He processed his subjects with impressive efficiency, his procedures averaging 18% faster than Ven's. The production quotas were not just met, but exceeded. The administratum commended the facility for its performance. The machinery of the Imperium ground on. In the water reclamation facilities, Servitor 749 Theta finally failed. 41 years of service ended when its augmented heart simply stopped, the muscle tissue too degraded to continue functioning. Tech priests arrived to deactivate it and transport it to recycling. The servitor that had been Caster-Vrel was dissolved in chemical vats, its augmentations extracted and refurbished, its organic components rendered down to base materials. Mira lasted 3 more years before her own systems failed. Father and daughter reunited in the recycling vats, their atoms mixing in the chemical dissolution, their flesh transformed into nutrients and raw materials that would be used to create more servitors in an endless cycle of consumption and reproduction. The manufactorum processed 642 servitors per day, 234,330 per year, millions across the Imperium, billions over decades. The count was infinite. The count was eternal. The count was the price humanity paid for survival in a hostile galaxy. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the question remained unanswered. Was the price justified? Did the mathematics of necessity truly balance the equation of suffering? Could any civilization call itself worth preserving if preservation required the systematic destruction of millions of its own people? The Imperium had no answer, or perhaps it had an answer but could not afford to acknowledge it. The machinery continued. The servitors served. The atrocity endured, and somewhere in the infinite void between stars, perhaps the Emperor himself looked down upon his Imperium and wept for what it had become. Or perhaps he approved, calculating as Krath and Ven and Thule had calculated, determining that any price was acceptable if it meant humanity's survival for one more generation. No one knew. No one could know. The Emperor sat silent on his golden throne, his thoughts unknowable, his judgment withheld, or perhaps already delivered in the form of the Imperium itself, a vast machine of suffering, built on broken minds and lobotomized slaves, justified by mathematics that could not balance, but continued calculating nonetheless. The servitors served. The Mechanicus created. The Imperium endured. And the true cost of eternal servitude remained exactly what it had always been. Everything that made human existence meaningful, sacrificed endlessly on the altar of survival, mourned only by those who had to perform the sacrifice and could not escape their complicity. In the end, there was only the work, and the work, like the Imperium itself, was eternal.